uncertainties and doubts, tug of wars. Can the world still come to a consensus and eventually agree on a roadmap? All eyes are on the G20 summit. Will it bring more hope or more uncertainty? I will be here in Osaka, taking you up close with the epicenter of the global powers. Making Sense, World Insight Special at the G20 Summit in Osaka, only on CGTN. Hello and welcome to Making Sense, the World Insight Special on the G20 Summit. I'm Tian Wei. Standing before the Osaka Castle, one of the iconic landmarks of the summit's host city, one can't help but wonder, will this meeting be remembered as one about harmony and perhaps cooperation, or one that exposes deeper divisions in our world today? In our special programs this week, we're trying to help you make sense of what's going on beneath the surface at the summit, how that is going to significantly affect us, and in what ways. First, the latest.
The Osaka G20 summit will undoubtedly be an enormous challenge. It comes at a time of trade tensions between China and the U.S., continued uncertainty over Brexit, and escalating U.S. Iran tensions. The focus of the Osaka G20 will include trade, where some countries are seeking to promote multilateral platforms, including reform of the World Trade Organizations. Although significant breakthrough is not expected on the trade front, it needs prudence to avoid China-US issues to take center stage of this summit. Topics range from strengthening global economic growth, driving innovations, climate change, WTO reform, women's empowerment, and rules for the digital economy. The Osaka G20 is packed with topics to discuss, with limited time for discussion. However, some topics were likely to draw a heated debate, such as climate change. French President Emmanuel Macron said the final communiqué must mention the 2016 Paris Climate Change Agreement, in which the US is likely to oppose. With several contentious issues and so many topics to discuss, it will be a challenge to find common ground in preparing the final joint communiqué. The question is, will this G20 summit this year can come up with an effective communiqué or a watered-down statement?
What's the significance of this year's G20 summit? With us in our Osaka studio, Yuyuki Yoshino, the Dean of the Asia Development Bank Institute. He's also the chair of the T20, which is a policy advice network for the G20. What a pleasure to have you, Professor Yoshino. Of course, G20 this year, many believe the summit is of extreme importance for how the world is likely to be run for the future. What do you make of it?
I think the importance of G20 is each leader is representing their own country. But when they come to G20, I hope they can also look at each issue from the top of the globe, so as if they are the world leader. I think that is a very important balance between representing each country, also looking at from entire globe. And also recently there are tension between US and China is becoming the market of the uncertainty of the future. So I hope their meeting together will make the market regain their confidences.
What do you think are some of the key issues if the leaders coming to the G20 summit be able to handle well? This could be called a successful one.
There are several topics which could be discussed.
Well, there are a lot of topics, I have to say.
One is climate issues and global warming, and how to get rid of plastic waste. That is one of the topics. And second one is infrastructure investment and quality infrastructure. And third one is aging population, how aged economy can be cope with the various issues. And fourth one is universal health care. And the fifth one is taxation on digital economy.
There are a lot of them. That's why I'm asking what are likely to be the priority. If handled well, this could be called a success.
I think first one is climate issue is very important. Second one is trade dispute, including the market-based exchange rate and freer capital mobility. And third one will be infrastructure investment.
Of course, when you talk about climate change, you already have the division. For example, one of those largest economies in the world do not even subscribe to the climate change agreement signed by all economies. In some early years. So what do you make of that? This division will be eventually resolved, or we're likely to see deeper ones?
I think the disclosure of data in climate issues will be very important. How much CO2 each country is exhausting, and what the temperature is changing in each country. Then people can realize how much they are responsible for the climate changes. I think it is not only the leader, but also the people in each country should realize the problem.
And finally, for you, of this area of discussion, Professor, is whether geopolitics is likely to drive the whole discussion this time at the G20 summit, and how dangerous is it if that were the case?
I think it's important, again, each people should look at globally rather than stressing their opinions from each country. So I think US, Europe, and Asia, those are the balanced economies. So three groups together will make a very nice world in the world.
Mr. Naoki Yoshino, you want to stay with us? We're going to talk to you a bit later. Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Osaka, Japan for this year's G20 summit. He will attend the 14th G20 summit at the invitation of the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. President Xi has just wrapped up his bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Abe Thursday evening, a day before the start of the G20 summit. Leaders of the two Asian powerhouses are expected to lay the groundwork to step up bilateral economic cooperation. During Abe's visit to China in October last year, he said his meeting with President Xi at the G20 could advance relations. So, could G20 talks indeed breathe new life into Sino-Japan relations? What concrete results can we expect from the two leaders meeting at the summit? Stay with us once again in our Osaka studio, Naoki Yoshino, who is the Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute, also Professor Emeritus at Keio University. And in our Beijing studio, we have Professor Jia Zhaojiong, a Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies of Peking University. Welcome once again to both of you. Professor Jia, I want to start with you. You stayed in Japan for quite a long period of time. Now, your understanding of Japan's hard work in making sure this G20 summit would eventually work?
Yes, actually, for Japan, this is probably a G20 that comes of late. Back when China hosted G20 in 2016, Japan was also campaigning for that. And this year it holds special significance for Japan because it holds the G7 as well. And later, in a couple of years, Japan will be hosting the Tokyo Summer Olympics again. So, indeed, like you said, Japan has worked real hard to make this a success.
So this is like a come-out party in a new era for Japan, is it, Professor Yoshino?
China is now growing very rapidly. So I hope that China will think about not only your own country, but also entire Asia, also globally.
I'm asking whether this is like a come-out party for Japan this time for the G20 summit, Professor.
Okay. I think our G20 for Japan is very important to discuss all the leaders together.
Certainly so, but we see Prime Minister Abe has been trying to make utmost effort in order to make Japan shuttling diplomacy work this time.
I think Japan is a very important position, and we are facing with aging population, and growth rate of the economy has been slightly declined, but Japan is trying very hard to make our economy to be alive and also cooperate with various countries together. And it is very important to make harmony, globalization, and multilateralism will be the key of G20.
Now, there's one thing very important, Professor Jia, if I could go to you. That is, how should we understand this time it's not a state visit by the Chinese president to Japan, but rather under the umbrella of the G20. Under the umbrella of a multilateral framework, how much can the two presidents, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Prime Minister of Japan be able to work together?
Well, let me say this by making two statements. One statement is that the G20 is more a forum for bilateral meetings. So if you subscribe to that, then it's completely normal for the leaders of China and Japan to make this a venue one for bilateral meetings. After all, leaders of both countries have leaders from all over the world to deal with. They have a lot of domestic issues. It does not mean, without a separate visit, there is a reduction of any commitment to improving the relationship. Now, on both sides. Secondly, China and Japan relations, in a rather peculiar way, over the past decade or so, has matured to the extent that you don't really require frequent leaders' meetings for the two societies to interact with each other. Earlier, for example, Professor Yoshino mentioned a lot of common challenges, for example, aging, for example, dealing with the environment or climate change. China and Japan have moved in many ways that societies, the levels of interactions are closer rather than further away, even without the frequency of the high-level meetings as we sometimes miss in the media headlines.
Professor Yoshino, we understand earlier, right before the G20 summit, the U.S. President Donald Trump was making statements saying, well, Japan, if being attacked, the U.S. would have to make utmost effort in order to save Japan, but not the other way around, and therefore he felt it was unfair. Of course, later, your State Cabinet Secretary coming out and say, oh, confirmed with White House, nothing has changed. But rhetoric like this coming from the U.S. President, what kind of message does that send to Tokyo?
I think Japan lost our World War II. Then we are prohibited to have our own military forces. So we only have self-defense force. And physically speaking, we are not so much strong compared to other nations. So I think peaceful negotiations and relations with various countries are very important. So in that context, Japan should keep not so big military forces, but also cooperating with other countries, not military relations, but economic relations and other ties are the role of Japan that we should do.
Talking about the economic relations, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has sought to bring about 40 million overseas visitors to Japan by the year 2020. In recent years, Chinese visitors, of course, have contributed to Japan's tourism boom, and the city of Osaka is also one of the most popular destinations for Chinese tourists. Earlier, I visited a local market here to see how the Chinese visitors are spending their cold, hard cash and shored up Japan's tourism industry. Take a look. The Kuromo market, where we are in right now, has a history of 200 years. Even today, it boasts 170 different kinds of shops, mainly serving food, and of course, it's the Japanese delicacies. For example, this shop, whose owner I just got to know. Hello, sir. Good to see you once again. Hello. You got a lot of wonderful fish over there. Oh, my God. Yes, exactly. Wow. So this is one of the best delicacies coming from Japan. Can we try? Okay, we try together. Okay. All right, then. All right, then. Well, obviously, you have a very busy day. So many customers. Okay, 好吃. Yes. He's speaking 好吃. In Chinese, it means delicious. Yes. Yeah. The fish is chewy and fresh. Wonderful. Yeah. Sporadic Chinese language coming out of this gentleman. Best lunch. Thank you very much. Good stuff you got over here. And I hope, and I hope good business for you as well. Nice meeting you. All right. We got more shops to visit. Come on, guys. And of course, that was little piece that we did in the local market called Kurramon Market in the center of Osaka, selling fresh produce. You know, one small example, Professor, already demonstrates how much is there in terms of people-to-people interaction, particularly recent years between China and Japan.
Yes. I think China and Japan, we should have multiple relationships be constructed. One is high school student, exchange of university student. In general public, many Japanese visit to China, and Chinese come to Japan, and also academic scholars exchange and politicians exchange. I think those different levels of the exchange is very important, and we have to know each other and cultural differences and so on. That will create a very term and long-term relations between the two countries. And furthermore, all the culture in 7th century, 6th century came from China through Silk Road. So we have to respect Chinese culture and decision-making systems and so on. Chinese character came from China to Japan.
Exactly. Professor Jia, on the other hand, there seems to be a lot of concrete things that the two sides could work on. For example, about the fight against the protectionism, both countries, China and Japan, embrace free trade. Meanwhile, there seems to be issues about the Belt and Road Initiative that Japan and China signed for cooperation in the third-party market. Tell us more about your thoughts about these concrete cooperation for the near future.
Well, actually, there is a demand for China and Japan to work together in what we call third-country markets. One good example is back in April, to be more precise, April the 2nd, the government of Thailand held a conference that brought Japanese and Chinese investors together, and the Thai government invited both companies from both China and Japan to join Thailand in developing a special economic zone in the southeast of Bangkok, near the Bay Area. So that's a good example. And in terms of the fight against trade protectionism, China is going through, in many ways, what Japan went through back in the early 80s in terms of tariffs, in terms of disputes over technology, royalties, or whatnot, competitiveness, or the competition for the future. China, in a strange way, back in the 80s, was the beneficiary of the Japanese trade differences with the United States of then. Today, of course, some of the Southeast Asian countries, most notably Vietnam, is benefiting in terms of the volume of trade from the disputes between China and the United States. So we see history repeating itself, but at the same time, no matter what happens, I would think there are laws of economic gravity. There are those essentials that are in place that both China and Japan need to work on to maximize the potentials of what sometimes scholars call natural economic territories. These are neighbors that cannot move away and do not want to move away from each other.
Jia Daojun and Naoki Yoshino, thank you for both of you for being with us. You're going to stay with us for further discussion in our program today. Stay with us here on World Insight Special at the G20 Summit in Osaka, Japan. We'll be back after this. As the G20 summit officially kicks off on Friday, most world leaders gathered in Osaka will likely seek a consensus on how to fix challenges to the global economy. They will have to find common ground amid rising unilateralism and protectionism. All eyes will be on the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump, set to take place on Saturday. In response to Mr. Trump's latest threats to slap more tariffs, the Chinese Foreign Ministry urged the U.S. to heed the domestic and international voices who oppose tariffs at the G20 summit, calling for dialogue to resolve China-U.S. trade disputes. Meanwhile, negotiators from both countries are preparing for bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the summit, according to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. So, will this year's G20 meeting deliver any concrete results between these two economies? to set the expectation, we are bringing in two guests. Once again, we have Naoki Yoshino, Dean of the Asian Development Banking Institute. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And John Curtin, who is the co-director and founder of the G20 Research Group. Welcome as well. Under the G20 umbrella, the two economies largest in the world are going to talk to one another, even though their talk broke down earlier. Now, Professor, what would you say will be the momentum for them to pick up that talk again?
I think on the trade issue, it's very much that they're both feeling the pain. In the case of the United States, Donald Trump is moving closer to his re-election campaign. He just opened his campaign a few days ago. And many of his core constituents, the farmers in Iowa, the manufacturers in the steel states, know that his tariffs are bad for them, and then the ones the Chinese government retaliates with, predictably, are even worse. He sees his support in the polls not going up. He knows he has to change course.
Yeah, so you're saying he's mainly talking here in the G20 for the domestic consumption, is it? Is that what you're saying?
Very much, but I think he understands that it's not that he needs trade liberalization just with China. He needs it with Mexico. He needs it with Canada.
Right.
He needs it with Japan, which is why a few weeks ago he said, Prime Minister Abe, I'm not going to impose my threatened tariffs on you. We're going to talk and try and do a deal.
But people have also noticed that on Sunday, for example, Professor, President Trump was talking to the media and talk about all economies are actually taking advantage of that of the United States. That's an exact quote. What do you think the leaders of these economies, when they're coming in for the G20 summit, is likely to take quotes like this? Are they going to see it as tactics or strategies by the United States?
I think each politician has their background.
I like that.
Addressing to their own people. But at the same time, G20, they have to think about global world. And it is not only trade issues, but also how capital flows are moved, and also exchange rates are determined. All those three has to go together. Otherwise, only talking about trade issues will not solve anything. So I hope that the market-oriented exchange rate system should be adopted in many countries, and also gradual capital flow, mobility should be liberalized.
Before we go to the capital flow, there's already the issue of protectionism, isn't it?
Yeah.
If that is not being tackled, how would a trade nation like yours, Japan, which is relatively geographically small and depending a lot on trade internationally, and also Canada, which is depending where you're from, a lot of trade with Mexico and the United States in North America, be able to survive and thrive? That is the question, isn't it, Professor?
Yes, I think Donald Trump is doing it partly tactically, partly politically, but he needs to understand that, look, the reason the United States is buying so much from Japan than the other way around is because the American economy is booming. Americans are rich enough to import more than the Japanese people are. So he'll have to be told, I think, that poor Canadians can't buy American exports, so we're all in this together, especially because we live in a world where we don't trade with each other, we make things together, integrated supply chains very deeply. For Canada, for Mexico, for Japan too, in the automotive industry, all the great plants of Japanese automotive manufacturers in the United States of America, giving good jobs there.
Right. Today we are already hearing, for example, Nissan and Renault are trying to cooperate even further. That was announced by the French president before he coming to the G20 summit. Obviously, a lot of economies are being very active and proactive before the summit, trying to indicate there is opportunities for cooperation, and that is crucial.
Yeah. In late 1980s, Japan and Germany were very much exporting to the United States. Then after that, what Japan companies have started is a production network, creating networks starting from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then corporations and bringing networks and factories into US and Europe. I think China is also doing that way in order to produce not only domestically, but also making production networks. That will also make the growth of other countries together. I think those production networks are very important to make globally.
Of course, China and the United States both are big economies in the world, and therefore, what kind of responsibilities do these economies have? And meanwhile, in order to make things our success, what do you think, Professor Curtin, will be the role of China, will be the role of the United States in encouraging the real discussion that should be going on in the G20 summit?
Well, certainly China knows that it has become a very successful, ever richer country because of the rules-based multilateral order, the World Trade Organization, and so many other multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, for example. So it knows it needs to keep those multilateral organizations strong, and that includes the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, a key one to deliver quality infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I think we'll see Chinese leadership expressed very well here again.
At this year's G20 summit,
Indeed.
we hope that will be the case. Are you worried that any kinds of geopolitics is likely to hijack the overall agenda of this year's G20 summit? Briefly.
I think the importance of the G20 is all the leaders come together and think about from global perspectives. That is the key of the success of G20.
But of course,
leaders should not talk about just their own nations.
We heard that message from you repeatedly, but of course there's the issue of the quality of leadership today vis-a-vis the responsibilities, actually, they should shoulder, Professor.
They're going to focus on North Korea and the nuclear problem, and there, the United States, China, Japan, they all want the same thing. We don't want a nuclear-armed North Korea where accidents can happen that will kill those who are its closest neighbors.
As diverse as the agenda in different people's minds as they are, one could see this is going to be a very interesting G20 summit, certainly, for sure. Thank you so much, Professor John Curtin and Professor Yoshino. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What are the pressing concerns on global governance? Let's ask our panelists once again. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Douglas Paul, a distinguished fellow of the Asia program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also in Beijing studio, Rong Ying, the vice president of the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Paul, go to you first. What about the expectation from Washington for President Trump to be able to fulfill his responsibilities this time at the G20 summit as the head of the United States?
Well, there's been a real lowering of expectations when it comes to President Trump and multilateralism. More focus will be on the bilateral contacts he has at this G20. And there's a hope that he will not mess up the plans for Prime Minister Abe, who has worked very hard to try to put the U.S. and President Trump in a position to reinforce Mr. Abe's leadership of this G20 summit just a month ahead of elections in Japan.
Well, Mr. Rong, though, is there much expectation for the two leaders coming from China and the United States to be able to come to consensus? How big is the chance?
Well, of course, I think everybody is hopeful. And of course, China and the Chinese side are very much hope that the meeting would come up with some positive and tangible results that would help. First, I think address the issues of the trade, but more importantly, I think it would bring the relation back to the track that unfortunately for the past few months, because not only because of the trade, but the other issues, and particularly the spillover effect that raising the question about what the relationship would go. I mean, as we are commemorating the 40th anniversary of the established diplomatic relations.
But of course, trade issue, Mr. Paul, is going to be one on the top of the agenda. There were earlier discussions as to what went wrong with the last rounds, what are the responsibilities of either side in any negotiation. It's very hard to say. So what do you think will be the strategy or tactics this time from President Trump, given the earlier statements that he's been making over the past few days?
Well, after the rejection of the last package on May 10th by China, we saw in the U.S. hardliners gain the upper hand, and there was a cascade of actions against Huawei, against other firms in China, putting out notices for further actions to try to restrict U.S.-China S&T and high-tech exchanges. And I think that has been also in China as well. We've seen a rise of hardliner policy there. The question for the leaders is this really where they want to go? Do they want to have the hardliners drive this on, and probably right through the American election in 2020? That's a choice for Mr. Trump. He's an unpredictable guy. He may very well want to take a more moderate approach, not get us into a kind of Cold War confrontation for months to come, and with the potential for increased tariffs. The most likely outcome as a consequence of this pull and push between hardliners and more moderate advocates is likely to be kicking the can down the road, as we say in English, postponing any agreement by ordering negotiators to go back to the table and find a way to keep talking before this issue comes to a head and before new tariffs are imposed on trade with China. That would suit Mr. Trump's political needs, because if he makes an agreement with China, he then would have to defend it against the 24 Democrats who are all campaigning to take his job away from him. If he doesn't make an agreement, he can portray himself as still being tough on China while keeping the door open eventually to an agreement which may be politically suitable sometime in the next 16 months. So I think this is likely to be one where a few smiles are shown, agreement has continued to talk, but a detailed agreement out of this meeting I think is not possible.
There's quite a strategy, it seems. However, Professor Rong, do you think China is in any urgency to reach any agreement with the United States if that were the strategy or tactics taken by the current White House?
Well, certainly I think China wants to have a stable relationship. We want to have a relationship that's featuring a coordination and collaboration. But I don't think China would accept sort of a kind of a deal, I mean, talking about deal, that would be undermined, believed to undermine its interest. And that's why it made it very clear, and that in terms of the principles of negotiations, that they're looking for a kind of a mutual benefit, and we're talking about a kind of mutual respect and based on equality. And it also, I think, advocating of an approach that this the negotiation had to be following the principle that accommodating each other's legitimate concerns on equal footing. So my understanding is that China is ready, China really wants a stable relationship, but China also has, I mean, a very much important principle that they uphold. And China, of course, want to show that it is a responsible country. It understanding that a stable relationship and agreement that China and the U.S. can agree would have implications, strong impact for global economy. And also, I think it shows that China is really a responsible country that upholds these principles.
Mr. Paul, there are a lot of people who are asking whether the United States is, or at least some of the hardliners, in your words, is trying to decouple China or decouple the rest of the world. Do you think that's a legitimate question?
I think it's a legitimate question. I think there are people actually trying to do that. I think it's also an impossible objective. We've gotten a too complex relationship, not only with China, but with all the rest of the world, that we can't simply pull these things apart. But there are people in important positions in government now, a few in the Congress, but many in the administration, who would like to see a decoupling of the two economies. They think this is the best way forward, even if people like me would say you can't do it.
Now, Mr. Rong, this is being done with an occasion of a multilateral framework, of course, the G20. How much do you think the other players will have an impact on the discussion going on between China and the United States? One note we need to bear in mind, that is, the two leaders are working their way bilateral, multilaterally before they're meeting one another on the very final day of this G20 summit this year. Your take?
Yeah, it's interesting to note that on the one hand, that I think all eyes, or or most of the eyes, if not all eyes, are on this, highly expected, summit. On the other hand, that it is taking place at the end of the series of summit meeting from the Chinese side. So I think the issue, the China and the U.S. trade issues have implications, big implications for the summit, or would cast a shadow whether on the summit itself, the G20 Osaka summit itself. It does not mean that China, take this as an only issue. I would also I would say that China also attach great importance to other meetings. Summit meetings with Japan, with and also the summit meeting. The meeting of the head of the BRICS and China, Russia, and India, and also China with other African states that have been there. So there are many meetings there, and I think. Certainly, this is not the only. It is an important meeting, but not the only meeting that China would like to have.
And what about for the United States? Is there, Mr. Paul, besides the China-U.S. summit taking place on the final day, will the U.S. be able to achieve anything strategic, even though with a White House that many of the elites in the U.S. might not necessarily buy into? However, President Trump is representing the United States. Are we going to see more positive move in any regard in terms of promoting global trade, or we're going to see creating more division about where the global supply chain will be and whether there will be a definite cutoff of it, and therefore all economies will have problems to adjust?
Well, if there is a positive multilateral agenda trying to be worked by the U.S. side, President Trump has been undermining it actively in the last 24 hours. On his way to Japan, he has been issuing a tweet storm which has threatened tariffs against India and Vietnam. The leaders such as Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister in Singapore, have in recent weeks spoken up to the U.S. to be more cautious in its efforts to force countries to choose between the U.S. and China. So I think, if anything, Trump is creating a coalition of caution against American policy in the region. Whether this is the intent of the government at large, I don't know. But we've seen Secretary Pompeo coming in for pretty sharp words in India and elsewhere on his recent travels. We've got the former Secretary of Defense getting tough words in Southeast Asia, and now Trump is issuing his own threats of tariffs here and there, kind of casual damage being done to a potential coalition that could be brought together to try to reform the World Trade Organization and upgrade the standards for trade to meet the needs of a much more complex and growing economy globally. So I don't see a global plan, I don't see a multilateral plan, I see wrecking ball instead.
If that were the case, Professor from China, Mr. Rong, how will China be able to face up to all of these mounting challenges if China's agenda were to fight against the protectionism, if China's agenda were to create more discussion about the multilateralism and the cooperation? Do you think China will have the support of the others? Some of these G20 economies certainly allies of the United States, even though they see differently on some issues.
Certainly, I think China would like to see more sort of coordination and more efforts made by the other members of G20 to oppose protectionism, and which is, I heard that it is one of the sticking point of the negotiations on the communique. And it also hope that the efforts will be made coordinatedly, to deal with issues so that has been like the reform of WTO, and also there are other issues that to ensure that like how to achieve sustainable development, how to promote innovation, and so on and so forth. The Chinese, by the way, it was the chair, back in 2016 at in Hangzhou, and put forward a very extensive and comprehensive agenda to how to promote global economic governance. And China came, ever since then, China has played a very much big role. And back in the, if you look at the process of G20, I think China it's a learning process for China, starting from, I think, a kind of participant from now active player and a leading player to how to shape the agenda and how to promote the agenda of global economic governance. So I think China would like to work together with as many countries as possible to ensure the agenda, the right agenda, and to ensure that the positive outcome would come, and equally important, ensure the summit would be successful under the leadership of Japan chair.
Okay, thank you so much, Douglas Paul, Rong Ying. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. That is me, Tian Wei, on behalf of my team, both in Osaka, Japan, and in Beijing, China. Thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for more insights from Osaka on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Bye for now.